back for yet another episode of the Familiar Stranger podcast. My close friend Mark Sayers joining me. Thank you for being with us.
It's an absolute pleasure.
Mark, you're the author of too many books to name off, and the pastor of Red Church in Melbourne, Australia, and just someone I've gotten to journey alongside and learn with and learn from for a long time. Mm-hmm. But the topic of supernatural healing is actually not one we've ever had just a direct, focused conversation on. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So among the ministry of the Spirit, I find that supernatural healing, biblically, it kind of just gets thrown in with all the other gifts, right? It's like right there, wedged between words of knowledge and administration, in a list. But I do think that supernatural healing is unique in that it's really the only ministry of the Spirit. Maybe deliverance would be one other example, but is sought in absolute desperation from a life-defining experience, like a diagnosis, an injury, an accident, with the request that God make it a life-redefining experience. So if someone brought a word of prophecy and they missed the bullseye, it's kind of like no big deal. For most people, the go-to line within the Vineyard movement is like, nobody dies. But if God doesn't heal, somebody might die. And so I think it's one that I sort of just want to bypass a lot of the biblical theology and say, read the book. I get into lots of that stuff and jump right into the human experience. So to define the term, what we mean by supernatural healing is God bringing about healing by the ministry of Jesus, administered through the power of the Spirit that is indwelling his people, beyond the means of medical healing. So apart from the supernatural intervention of God, this doesn't happen. So maybe, could I start just by asking, have you ever experienced supernatural healing? Either personally, have you witnessed it? Is this rumor to you, or has it become reality?
I mean, it's such a great question. And actually, as you were saying that those different gifts, I wonder whether it's sometimes in desperation I've wanted the gift of administration. But I mean, the word supernatural is really interesting because in some ways there's some loadedness to that term. A very clear delineation between what is natural and what is outside of natural. And that's been defined very much by the scientific method, the limits of scientific discovery. But I wonder if that limit, that border is more blurred and porous than we realize. And we may discover something in science and then rediscover it. We were chatting before off air how some of the things we thought we knew about psychology and mental health are all of a sudden being challenged. So it's a really interesting one. I don't know if I have a comfortability that there's this hard stop between the two. And sometimes you don't know. So a couple of things, and the first one's maybe that blurred, area. So my wife, Judy, was diagnosed with breast cancer, which then subsequently found it had spread to her lower spine, which meant it was metastatic. And I know, your own diagnosis is very similar time to hers.
And we've journeyed some of that together.
Yes, totally. And I remember we sat when we were just processing this news, and we were shown or told the medical process we would go, which was chemotherapy plus these particular new targeted drugs. And we sat down with a friend who was an oncologist from church, and we're just chatting about it. And we were obviously praying for a miracle. It's a very, very sober diagnosis. And I remember he said this line, he goes, if you get healed, you're not going to know if it's a miracle or not. So basically the healing would be that when the first scan came in or subsequent scans, that she would be cancer-free. Now, we would never know if this was a supernatural like complete thing, or had the actual drugs worked. There's no test, it's not like a COVID test where I got 2 lines there. I was definitely supernatural.
And our medical technology isn't such that we have predictable means of the effectiveness of chemotherapy across the board for different types of cancer.
And also too, there are people who at different times who, are not praying for healing, don't have any belief, all of a sudden an issue that has been misdiagnosed or just has rectified itself, So the human body has its own potential to do strange things that, again, where is it in that grey zone border between supernatural and natural? So when we first got the diagnosis, we was texting friends, and then I just remember I just couldn't get onto everyone. So I just put up a little announcement on Instagram, and it just went viral. And the amount of people that were praying for us was staggering. At first there was groups of people we knew, went beyond people we knew. I remember hearing that churches in Malaysia, I remember hearing a Tamil-speaking church in Malaysia was praying for us. And then I remember hearing underground Iranian churches are praying for this. And I couldn't believe it. It was so humbling. When we got the first scan back, it was just incredibly good results. That Trudy's initial tumor had completely gone from what the first test was, and you could feel it, like it was fully there. And then also that there wasn't, it seemed to be any in a system. So I remember I was in this really strange place where I'm like, I don't know, how do I process this? And I remembered our friend's word, you're not going to know if this is a miracle. So there's almost a sense of faith in understanding and processing the miracle as well. And then I also thought through a number of other things. I thought, again, talking to our friend, the oncologist, these drugs that Trudy's on weren't available years earlier. Secondly, in my country with our universal healthcare, we don't pay anything for them. And many other people, I'm not possibly even here, would not have access to these drugs. And I was watching a documentary about the Australian Prime Minister who brought in our healthcare system. And I actually watched it and I got sort of emotional that, like if I was in another country, Trudy's life expectancy would be very different. So for me, I feel like it's this big matzo ball of like blurred lines and when has God moved? What I do feel is that God has moved at this stage. Is that through the drugs? Is that through supernatural healing? I just don't know. So there's a realm of faith that I've stepped into here. Do I believe that, again, using that term, supernatural healing happens? Yes. I know of people who've had incredible supernatural experiences. To add one more personal story, when I was 30, I was diagnosed with bipolarity, and it was an incredibly difficult diagnosis. It did explain a lot of my experience since I was younger and explain what was happening to me at that time. And looking back now, I realized that there was a period there where I was more unwell mentally than I realized. Interestingly, I've had this feeling of late, and again, I'm saying this publicly, so this is all not hard and fast, where I notice a lot of the things I struggle with aren't there. And I remember when I first got bipolarity, I was really praying, Lord, like this seems like too much of a burden to carry. I remember watching a documentary on bipolarity and, just seeing the life expectancy and life results for people with bipolarity are really pretty grim. And, I didn't want to be a father. I didn't want to be a pastor. I had to carry this. But I felt the Lord also said, are you willing to walk through this pain? And I felt like, yes, Lord. But then I'm asking this question, like, I don't experience it in the same ways. I used to experience it when I would travel like I have to this trip, where my time zones were out of whack. And I remember talking to a psychiatrist in LA after I got off a flight. He's like, you got to be real careful, about time zones. But then I just don't experience it. So I'm in this interesting place where the two things that I've been intimately connected with, I don't know where those boundaries are, but do I see God's hand in all of this 100%?
Yeah, and I think what I hear you talking about is just the mystery of answered prayer.
Yes.
Even broader than just the mystery of healing.
Yes.
Because like a couple of instances I talk about in the book that were really faith-building for me is in my 20s as a pastor, Malaysian immigrant woman who was at my church because she was living in the U.S. for 3 months, came and asked me to pray for miraculous healing of an eye condition. And I did, and I'd never done that before, and it instantly happened.
Yes.
And it was a medically diagnosed condition requiring surgery that was then medically re-diagnosed as 20/20 vision, no medical attention needed. Similar instance with my son. When my son Hank was 2 years old, he had a dislocated shoulder. One of the elders came over with anointing oil to pray for healing, and his shoulder just realigned.
Wow.
So like I've seen those instant answers to prayer, but then you're also saying, yeah, and sometimes I don't know how much the hand of God was involved. And isn't that how prayer works, you know?
Yes.
I saw this lost friend come to faith over the course of many conversations over 3 years, and I regularly prayed for them. Would that have happened had I not prayed? Who knows? And there's other instances of, God, I pray, you know, my neighbor Steve would come to church today. Oh, my word, he showed up. He's never showed up.
Yes.
And he gave his life to the Lord.
Yes.
That seems more straightforward. But of course, if we believe God does one, we have to believe that he might operate in the other. So then I think the question is, for you, as the leader of a community of Jesus followers, what is the responsible way to steward a ministry like healing? Like, what place does it have in the local church community?
I mean, for me, this comes down to, I think, a theology of the kingdom. And, you know, Jesus announced the kingdom, you know, it's here. So there's that sense where the miraculous is possible and God is doing things. And these are 4 tastes of the kingdom coming in fullness at the end of the age. But then also it's in process, you know, it's here but not here fully. Again, going back to the example of, you know, Trudy and I were leading through this publicly when you've got a cancer diagnosis, and Trudy's, you know, one of our pastoral, you know, is a pastor at church. I'm the pastor leading the church. And, you know, our thing we said to people is we're praying for healing, but we're also submitting to God's will. And there's a sense where I think that's a really helpful thing to say to people, you know, because, you know, I've been in situations where people have desperately, you know, wanted to be healed of something which will take their life, and they have lost their life. And to see the devastation that can cause on people's faiths when that in between here and not here yet theology is not in place. But then I've also seen the other example when the people have no capacity for the miraculous. They see the miracles as something perhaps in the past, in the days of Scripture. So it's this in-between place that you have to communicate. So for me, it's rooted in our kingdom theology expression.
Yeah, I would agree. I think as oversimplified as this could sound, it's almost like just recalling that one of our primary occupations as Jesus followers is to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And so as followers of Jesus, one of the places we do that is by the bedside of the hurting, right? And so if I go long stretches of time in my discipleship to Jesus and don't find myself celebrating the healing of the body, something might be off.
Yes.
And if I go long stretches of time and don't find myself grieving the tragedy that is sin, numbering our days this side of eternity, then something also might be off. Because we're called to find ourselves in both of those spaces.
Yes.
And to be a follower of Jesus is to become comfortable having one foot in heaven and one foot on the earth at all times.
Yes.
And kind of straddling those two ages, you know?
100%, yeah.
So then, I want to zoom out a little bit and ask, what broader cultural forces or maybe mental blocks within people, what keeps us from bringing our needs for the miraculous to God?
What's really interesting, like, one thing I've been surprised at over the years is people I've known who are not believers, who when faced with a devastating diagnosis, become very open to healing. And so I think that's something we need to be aware of. I think there's more people out there who, it's very easy to be a, cynical rationalist when your life's great and you're sitting there, in a comfortable lounge room. However, when you're just sitting in a doctor's office and you've just got a diagnosis and you're out of control, or if someone is just had a terrible accident, there's an old saying, there's no atheists in foxholes in war. And I think, first of all, we need to be aware that there's more people out there in supposedly secular environments who are very open to prayer. I was literally just here in San Francisco getting a coffee, and I was just watching the street and saw this young woman. It was in an area where there's lots of Asian supermarkets, and saw this young woman who wasn't Asian, and she was walking with real purpose, and she walked straight into a store, and above it said Chinese healer. And, there's a lot of people out there seeking things outside of the Western rationalist framework to find healing. So I think that's number one. I think secondly, we have been given a secular worldview. We were born in a particular secular environments, and that shapes our worldview. Often that's not questioned, as often you don't ask a fish for a definition of water.
Right.
That's very true. And again, too, I think when we're in control, we're very used to being in control, that such ideas like that would mean that we'd have to lose control because you're praying to something and someone outside of your control to do something that is outside of your control as well. So I think those two things are really key. More people are open. Our culture has a spirit of control, and our culture is rooted in a secular worldview that most people throughout history and most people in the world don't believe.
It is interesting how often healings in the New Testament are tied to evangelism.
Yes.
How often one happens in the same scene, often to the same person or people involved in a particular healing, and how underutilized of an evangelism strategy it is in the modern church.
Yes.
We seem to think only through the rationalistic lens that we've been given and think people come to faith by receiving a particularly persuasive understanding of Jesus that would lead them to openness to experience. But healing is people come to faith because they profoundly lose control of their lives and then experience the inbreaking kingdom of God in a way that causes them to begin to ask questions that they weren't interested in asking prior to that.
Yes.
And even in my own pastoral experience, I remember years and years ago leading a church in New York City, and one of the more mature leaders in our church was just kind of desperate to have a miraculous healing service for the longest time. And, I was always sort of cautiously open to it, thinking, what's going to happen there? And then we finally went for it. And it was on a Saturday afternoon, and it was entirely made up of people who had invited unchurched friends and neighbors who were so open to coming to church, to being prayed for healing, or being in an environment where people were praying for healing and had no interest in hearing me preach.
Yes.
Yes. And it was such a fruitful and beautiful time of gathering. And we saw new people kind of as the star players, if you will, of that ministry that weren't in the structure of our Sunday services and small groups and so forth. So that is such a beautiful invitation for the church to occupy. I want to talk a little bit more about the control thing.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that we in the Western world got used to a profound illusion of control that became accessible to a much broader swath of people than had ever happened before in human history, including myself. I grew up in a world where I could be in Southeast Asia this time tomorrow. I could access anything that I wanted in terms of product, people, anything like that. I could eat any type of food I wanted, whether it was in season or not. Basically the world was actually at my fingertips.
Yes.
And then a global pandemic happened.
Yeah.
And I got introduced to my fragility. And now we're in this moment where my fragility has been hidden from me again, but I do sense that it's a brief restoration of that illusion of control.
Yes.
There's, even as we're recording this, there's so much global conflict brewing.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder, what might it mean for us as people of the kingdom to prepare for a culture that is living more out of control, or is shaken awake from that illusion? Or is that even what we should be preparing for in your estimation?
Yeah. One of the great stories the West tells about itself is that, the West repressed its sexual urges. And that one of the reasons that there was mental health issues, that there was things that were called like hysteria, that what was making us mentally ill was the fact that our sexual impulses were repressed. And this is very much what Sigmund Freud, talked about civilization as being this lattice, this structure which kept all that stuff down. And these sort of urges below, or violence, And it's really interesting if you look at today. You wouldn't argue, comparative to again most cultures throughout history, a culture in the past, that it's sexually repressed. You can just walk the streets, press a button, and you're exposed to everything. But I would say we're repressed around suffering. We're repressed around our loss of control. And so, just as you had these moments where sexual urges would break through the veneer of polite society, we have these moments where it's like, the emperor is shown without clothes. And I think you're right. COVID was one of the most mass-scale global examples of that. And it shook a lot of people. I know global interest in prayer online and Google searches for prayer, even in very secular Scandinavian countries, absolutely shot up through that first 6-7 weeks of COVID. COVID's death toll, or morbidity was lower than what was initially thought. But imagine if it wasn't. Like you look at some, like the bubonic plague, where you had this really high death ratio, or even like other types of flus. We've got an avian flu that's sort of bubbling along in the background at the moment, and the more that society pushes into the natural environment, that's when you tend to get plagues and pandemics. There's highly likely we'll see another one, possibly with a higher level. And, I think this exposes the structural nature of secularism, that it is based on that sense of control. But I think we will see in examples of war, economic crisis, environmental crisis. As we also speak, there is, war in the world, but there's also tremendous environmental disasters happening in terms of natural disasters in this country. Look at the news this morning. And, all of these things give the impression that, we're not in control. So it's actually the return of the repressed reality, that there is a world, that humans are finite. You go into the middle of Australia and you look at the sky where there's no lights, city lights, and you just get confronted with this vast panorama of stars, and you realize how absolutely small you are. I remember my friend at the turn of the millennium went with his cousin out into literally the middle of Australia, and when it turned midnight, there was nothing, because again, time, our calendar, is a part of our human civilization. So I think as we have more of those encounters, you're going to see more of a hunger for an explanation which explains that, hang on, there's got to be more than just us being in godlike control.
And in that environment, then a desire for the miraculous is less like hocus pocus for a certain person, and more a natural human instinct, right?
Yes.
And that seems to be what I read a lot in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, is people who are in desperate circumstances that hear that there might be hope to be found in this renegade rabbi named Jesus, and he's passing through my town. And so it doesn't matter if I am the synagogue leader Jairus with my ailing daughter, or the woman with the 12-year hemorrhage sneaking in. I am in need of hope.
Yes.
And so if there's rumor of hope here, then I want to get close enough to touch it and see if it's real. But then on the other side of the coin, you have the inevitable reality that any community that pursues hope for healing in the midst of the loss of control that is a health diagnosis or a mental health diagnosis must become a community that can steward disappointment.
Yes.
Or I would say that can steward the redemption of my pain when God doesn't remove my pain.
Yes.
So can you speak to that a little bit and what that looks like, maybe what it's looked like for you and Trudy, or what it looks like in your local church community?
Yeah. I think when Trudy got her diagnosis, the board and stuff were fantastic, like whatever you need, Mark. But I really felt the Lord asking me to preach through that season. So I preached for 11 weeks straight when I was caring for Trudy and through her treatment. And that wasn't some heroic, watch me stoically press on.
Like a crisis adrenaline response or something. Yeah.
I just felt like I need to testify in season and out. And, I remember the first week, getting up, there were literally people weeping, not because of what I was saying, just because of the situation. And, my kids were at church and people were just really moved by that. And, I think of friends where their story's been similar, but it's not ended up where we're at now, So I think when I read, I love reading the stories of great men and women of God throughout history. I'm yet to find the one who just had this awesome life and died happily and, at a very old, it's like the Godfather, the Godfather dies in this nice way, with his kids playing in the rose garden, which is an irony that you can be a bad person and die a comfortable life. And you can be a good person and die a painful, experience at the end of your life. But I think testifying well in the midst of suffering is really key. And I think there's an element where there is suffering, again, is part of that repression. We don't want to talk about suffering. If there's some kind of suffering, we must have some grand answer for it. Lots of suffering is the cause of, some structural injustice. But then there's also just absolute, seemingly just cruelty of fate. And there's not a reason for that. I remember we'd gone through a difficult period at church with a bunch of stuff, and then this diagnosis literally came on the wake of that. And I remember a lot of people saying to me, couldn't believe that had happened to us. I couldn't believe it. But then there's a sense of, what, I'm still going to follow Jesus, So I think that sermon series, I hope there was some great content in it, but I think what preached louder was the posture. And I think when you lead like that, I think there's been a big thing. I realized a lot of churches, contemporary churches, and in our church's contemporary church, there's almost been not a prosperity gospel of give this percentage of money and you'll get a Ferrari. But I think there's almost this implicit prosperity gospel of the pastor and who's, got their entire life together and, you want to aspirationally be like your pastor. I think that it's a dangerous thing. There's obviously some aspirational things, that we want people to live like us if we're imitating Christ. But I think there's something really redeeming and freeing when if you're leading people inevitably will walk into suffering. So how you walk through that is going to be an example to others.
Yeah, and I think there's supernatural healing will maybe awaken a longing for the same from others if they know you've experienced it.
Yes.
And finding God in the midst of suffering seems even more potent for drawing out the experiences of others. In my own cancer journey, I can say this. I've gone through a couple of bouts with this now. The first time, I had the quickest cancer journey of all time. It was a 10-day stint. Went from diagnosis, how did this happen to you? You're a healthy young person. There's no explanation, no cancer on either side of my family of any variety. And the elders gathered together to pray. There was one operation, a tumor's removed. Biopsy is we've gotten everything, scans are clear. It's a miracle.
Yes.
And that, I think, drew out a few people. And then I led a healing prayer training with no hair on my body in the midst of chemotherapy.
Yeah.
But again, not for heroics, but because it was on our calendar that we had planned for the ministry year. And it just happened to fall in the midst of me going through suffering that God wasn't intervening on to remove the pain in an immediate way. And it was packed to the rafters.
Yeah, wow.
It was, and it wasn't come forward for healing at the front. Everyone was praying for one another for healing in the seats, because I think there's something about preaching a message of hope from a place of pain that allows people to bring both their pain and their hope.
Yes.
And that's what it means to be people of the kingdom that we're proclaiming, just as you were saying. And so I think if we're going to become mature communities of healing, we have to become mature communities of suffering.
Yes, yes.
And if we're going to become mature communities of suffering, we have to believe in God for healing.
Yes.
You just cannot inherit the fruit of one without the other. And there's no greater example of this than the life of Jesus, right? Miraculous ministry, and the most fruitful act of healing was the one that involved his own suffering, through which he heals the gash that's opened up in the whole of creation, right?
Yes.
So, Mark, thank you for being with us. In particular, thank you for sharing your story related to your mental health. I think maybe more than anything, that is an area that people are reticent to ask for healing.
Yes.
And so I do hope that viewers and listeners to this conversation might be open to begin hoping that their current mental diagnosis or condition might not have to be a forever kind of thing.
Amen.